The rain knew what Thomas Lawson refused to admit, that some promises become prisons dressed as devotion. At 70 years old, the veteran stood where he had stood countless times before, his weathered hands gripping the iron fence surrounding Private Miller's grave at Arlington National Cemetery, rain streaming down his face like accusations. The city of Arlington slept, but Thomas remained awake, a statue of flesh guarding stone, refusing the umbrella offered by a stranger who could not understand that comfort was betrayal. Tomorrow, the president would arrive, drawn by a story of loyalty that had somehow reached the highest office, but tonight belonged only to the dead and the dying, to the veteran who had made a promise 47 years ago and had never learned how to break it. The rain arrived at Arlington National Cemetery just after midnight, tentative at first, then insistent, drumming against the white headstones like fingers tapping out Morse code messages from the underworld. Thomas Lawson felt the first drops penetrate the collar of his coat, cold trails racing down his spine, and he welcomed them as he welcomed all discomfort, as proof that he was still alive when Private Daniel Miller was not. The cemetery stretched in all directions, row upon row of marble markers gleaming wet in the sparse lamplight. Each one a story ended, a promise broken by circumstance or fate or enemy fire. Thomas stood at section 60, plot 237, where the earth had swallowed his friend 47 years ago, on a Tuesday that felt both yesterday and a lifetime distant. His legs ached with the particular pain of 70-year-old joints asked to bear more than their design intended, the kind of deep bone protest that had become his constant companion since his 60th birthday. The veteran's hands, scarred and liver-spotted, gripped the wet iron fence that separated the living from the dead, knuckles white with the intensity of his hold, as though letting go of the metal would mean letting go of Miller himself. Around him, the cemetery was silent, except for the rain's percussion and the distant hum of traffic on Memorial Drive. The city of Arlington continuing its indifferent dance, while Thomas performed his solitary ritual. He had come here every week for 47 years, through snow and heat, through marriages and divorces, through the births of children and the funerals of parents. But tonight felt different in a way he could not name. The water gathered in the brim of his old service cap, spilling over in miniature waterfalls whenever he moved his head, and his coat, the same worn leather bomber jacket he had kept since his discharge in 1978, had darkened from brown to black with saturation. Thomas could feel his socks growing wet inside his boots, the uncomfortable squish of fabric against skin, but he did not move from his position. To his left, someone had placed fresh flowers on a neighboring grave, the blooms already beaten down by the rain's assault, petals scattered across the grass like casualties of a gentler war. To his right, a marble angel spread stone wings over a family plot, its face worn smooth by decades of weather, its expression of eternal sorrow now just a blank oval of white stone. Thomas wondered if Miller's grave would one day be forgotten like that, reduced to an anonymous marker in an endless field of the dead. He had promised Miller, in those final moments in the jungle outside Da Nang, that he would never be alone, never be forgotten, never become just another name on a wall that people photographed without reading. The memory of that promise lived in Thomas's body like shrapnel that had never been extracted, a foreign object that his flesh had grown around but never absorbed, always pressing against nerve endings, always reminding him of the debt unpaid. Miller had been 19 years old when the landmine had torn through him, young enough that his face still carried the softness of boyhood, old enough that he understood he was dying. Thomas, 23 at the time, and already ancient by comparison, had held him as the jungle sounds went quiet and the medic's hands stilled, had watched the light leave eyes that were the color of creek water back home in Tennessee, had felt the final breath leave lips that whispered his mother's name. The rain intensified, And somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the Virginia sky like artillery fire from a war that never ended. A car passed on the road beyond the cemetery's edge, its headlights sweeping across the rows of graves, illuminating the dead for a brief moment before plunging them back into darkness. And Thomas thought about how that was what memory did, threw light on the past in unpredictable flashes before shadow reclaimed everything. He had tried to explain it to his ex-wife once, this need to stand guard, this compulsion to bear witness, but she had looked at him with eyes full of pity and exasperation and told him that Miller was dead, and no amount of standing in cemeteries would change that fundamental fact. She had not understood that Thomas knew Miller was dead, had known it for 47 years, but knowing and accepting were separated by a distance greater than the space between living and dead. A figure emerged from the rain, an older woman in a transparent raincoat, walking the cemetery paths with the slow gait of someone visiting regularly, someone who had her own dead to tend. She paused when she saw Thomas, her face illuminated briefly by a flash of distant lightning, and for a moment their eyes met across the graves, two veterans of grief recognizing each other across the battlefield of memory. She offered a small nod, an acknowledgement that required no words, and continued on her way, her footsteps silent on the wet grass. Thomas watched her disappear into the rain and wondered what promise kept her returning, what name she whispered to the stone, what guilt or love or combination of both had carved a groove in her life that led inevitably to this place. He turned back to Miller's grave, to the simple marker that read only name, rank, dates of birth and death, and service number, and began to recite the words he always spoke. The man appeared sometime after 1 in the morning, materializing from the rain like a spirit taking temporary flesh, his umbrella a black dome that seemed to carve out a dry circle in the deluge. Thomas heard the footsteps before he saw the figure, the particular sound of shoes on wet pavement, deliberate and unhurried, and he tensed automatically, his body remembering decades-old training about approaching threats and vulnerable positions. But when the man came into view, Thomas saw only a civilian in his 40s, wearing an expensive raincoat and carrying an umbrella that probably cost more than Thomas's monthly veterans benefits check. The stranger's face was kind in the way that faces of people who have never experienced real hardship often are, soft around the edges, unlined by the type of grief that rewrites facial architecture. The man stopped a respectful distance away, perhaps 10 feet, his umbrella casting a shadow that the rain immediately filled, and for a long moment he simply stood there, watching Thomas with an expression that combined curiosity and concern. Thomas could feel the scrutiny like heat on his skin, could sense the stranger trying to solve the equation of why an elderly man would stand in the rain at a gravesite in the middle of the night, trying to determine if this was devotion or dementia, love or lunacy. The rain drummed against the umbrella with a sound like distant applause, and somewhere a branch cracked under the weight of accumulated water, the sharp report making Thomas flinch instinctively, his body remembering explosions that had happened before this man was born. The stranger noticed the flinch, and something in his expression shifted, recognition dawning that this was not ordinary grief, but the particular sorrow of soldiers. The man took a step closer, closing the distance to perhaps 6 feet, and spoke for the first time. His voice raised to carry over the rain, but still somehow gentle, the practiced gentleness of someone accustomed to dealing with fragile situations or fragile people. He said he had been driving past, had seen Thomas standing there, had felt compelled to stop, and now he was offering his umbrella with the sincere insistence of someone who believed kindness could be simple, could be as straightforward as keeping another human dry. Thomas looked at the offered umbrella, at the dry circle it promised, at the temporary relief from the rain's assault, and felt something in his chest tighten like a fist closing around his heart. The umbrella represented comfort, and comfort felt like betrayal, like admitting that his vigil was performance rather than duty, like suggesting that he deserved shelter when Miller had none. Thomas shook his head, the movement sending water flying from his cap brim, droplets catching the sparse light like tiny falling stars. And he spoke for the first time in hours, his voice rough from disuse and rain, and the perpetual grief that had taken up residence in his throat. He told the stranger that he had made a promise, that he would never leave Miller alone, that an umbrella was kindness, but kindness was not what was required here in this place where the dead outnumbered the living and memory was the only currency that mattered. The words came out harder than he intended, edged with a defensiveness that surprised him, and he saw the stranger's expression shift from concern to something deeper, a recognition that he had stumbled into a story much older and more complex than a simple gesture of charity could address. The rain continued its assault, indifferent to promises and gestures both. The stranger did not leave immediately, as Thomas expected, did not retreat in the face of rejection, as people usually did when confronted with grief that refused comfort. Instead, he lowered the umbrella slightly, letting some of the rain touch his own head and shoulders, a gesture of solidarity that was both touching and somehow insulting, as though weeks of standing in rain could be honored by a few moments of shared wetness. He asked about Miller, asked how Thomas had known him, asked the questions that people always asked when they encountered grief they could not comprehend, seeking to reduce the incomprehensible to narrative, to story, to something that could be understood and filed away and then forgotten. Thomas considered not answering, considered letting silence be his response, but something in the stranger's face, perhaps the genuine curiosity, perhaps the fact that he had not yet fled, made him speak. He told the story he had told 100 times before, but the rain changed it somehow, made it feel immediate again, made the 47 years collapse like a house of cards in wind, until he was 23 again, and holding a dying boy in the jungle mud. He spoke about Miller's laugh, which had been too loud and too genuine for war, about how he had kept a photograph of his mother in his helmet and would kiss it before every patrol, about how he had wanted to be a teacher when he got home, wanted to shape young minds instead of destroying them. Thomas's voice caught on that last detail, on the thought of all the students Miller never taught, all the lives he never touched, all the knowledge and kindness that had bled out into Vietnamese soil and never returned home. The stranger listened without interrupting, his umbrella now fully lowered, rain streaming down his face like tears he was not actually crying. When Thomas finished speaking, the silence between them felt weighted with more than just rain and darkness and the presence of thousands of dead. The stranger reached into his coat pocket, and Thomas tensed again, that old soldier's instinct about sudden movements never quite extinguished, but what emerged was only a business card, already damp from the rain before it even left the pocket. The man explained that he was a journalist, that he would like to tell Thomas's story if he would permit it, that maybe the promise Thomas had kept for 47 years deserved to be known by more than just the rain and the stone and the dead. Thomas took the card without looking at it, felt the wet cardboard already beginning to disintegrate in his fingers, and did not answer. The stranger waited for a response that never came, finally nodded once in understanding or acceptance or defeat, and walked back into the rain, his umbrella reopening like a black flower blooming in reverse. Thomas watched him disappear into the darkness, then let the business card fall from his fingers into the mud. Dawn arrived reluctantly at Arlington National Cemetery, the sky shifting from black to grey so gradually that Thomas could not identify the exact moment when night became day, when the rain-soaked darkness transformed into rain-soaked morning light. His legs had long since passed through pain into a kind of distant numbness. the messages from his nerve endings arriving at his brain like dispatches from a war too far away to matter anymore. The rain had not stopped, but had shifted into a fine mist that hung in the air like the breath of ghosts, coating everything in a film of water that was more atmosphere than precipitation. Thomas's hands still gripped the iron fence, but now his fingers felt frozen in position, locked into the metal as though flesh and iron had fused during the night, become a single entity of witness and memorial. Around him, the cemetery began its slow awakening to the daily reality of being a resting place for the nation's honored dead, though honored seemed like too small a word for what they deserved. Too insufficient a term for the magnitude of sacrifice represented by each white marker stretching into the mist. The first joggers appeared on the paths, their colourful athletic wear garish against the sombre landscape, their earbuds blocking out the cemetery's particular silence, their breathing loud and alive in a way that felt almost obscene among so much death. Thomas watched them pass without really seeing them, his vision blurred by rain and exhaustion and the peculiar tunnel vision that came from standing still for too long. The world narrowing to just this spot, just this grave, just this promise that had become both anchor and prison. A groundskeeper appeared driving a small cart along the service road and stopped when he saw Thomas still standing at Miller's grave. The man was in his 60s, Hispanic, with the weathered face of someone who had spent their life outdoors, and he looked at Thomas with the weary recognition of someone who had seen this before, seen veterans who could not let go, seen men and women who treated graves like they were doorways that might open if watched long enough. He called out something in a voice that was both concerned and resigned, asking if Thomas was okay, if he needed help, if someone should be called. But Thomas waved him off with a hand that trembled from cold and exhaustion. The groundskeeper lingered for a moment, clearly torn between duty and respect, then drove on, his cart leaving tracks in the wet grass that would be gone by afternoon. The mist began to lift slightly as the morning progressed, though the sky remained the color of old concrete, promising more rain to come, but allowing a brief reprieve, a pause in the deluge that had marked the night. Thomas could feel his body beginning to rebel in earnest now, the adrenaline and determination that had sustained him through the night starting to ebb, leaving behind only the stark reality of a 70-year-old frame that had been standing for nearly 8 hours. His back screamed with pain that felt almost bright in its intensity, a sharp burning that radiated from his lower spine up through his shoulders, and his feet had progressed beyond numbness into a disturbing absence of sensation, as though they belonged to someone else entirely. But still he did not move, could not move, because moving meant the vigil ended, and ending the vigil meant breaking the promise, and breaking the promise meant Miller was finally, truly, irreversibly alone. A family arrived to visit a grave 3 rows over, a woman with 2 teenage children, and Thomas could hear their voices carrying across the wet grass, quiet but still present, talking about someone called Grandpa and whether he would have liked the flowers they brought. The children were subdued in the way young people were in cemeteries, their usual energy dampened by the proximity to death, by the reminder that life was temporary and could be reduced to a stone marker with dates that never told the full story. Thomas thought about Miller's mother, who had died 15 years ago without ever knowing that a stranger stood guard at her son's grave every week, maintaining a vigil she had begged Thomas to abandon when it became clear it was consuming his life. She had told him that Daniel would not want this, would not want Thomas to sacrifice his own living for the sake of the dead. But Thomas had not believed her then, and did not believe her memory now. The sound of vehicles approaching made Thomas turn his head, the movement sending fresh waves of pain through his neck and shoulders, muscles protesting the change in position after hours of stillness. He saw 3 black cars moving slowly along the cemetery road, official-looking vehicles with tinted windows that reflected the grey sky and made it impossible to see who sat inside. The cars stopped near the administrative building, perhaps 200 yards from where Thomas stood, and doors began to open, figures emerging that were too distant to identify, but carried themselves with the particular authority that suggested government, suggested importance, suggested that something unusual was happening on this ordinary, rain-soaked morning. Thomas watched with detached curiosity, wondering vaguely if there was a funeral scheduled, some dignitary or fallen soldier being laid to rest with the ceremony and honor that the nation reserved for those it officially recognized. But the figures did not move toward a grave site for a funeral, did not gather around a fresh plot with a flag-draped coffin and uniformed honor guard. Instead, they began walking across the grass toward Section 60, toward where Thomas stood, and as they drew closer, he could make out more details. The Secret Service agents with their characteristic earpieces and watchful expressions, the military aides in their formal uniforms with insignia that caught what little light the morning offered, and in the center of the group, a figure that Thomas's exhausted brain struggled to process because it seemed impossible, seemed like a hallucination born of exposure and grief and the particular madness that came from spending the night conversing with the dead. The journalist from the night before walked alongside the group, no longer carrying an umbrella, but walking with purpose, with the satisfaction of someone who had fulfilled a promise of his own. And Thomas understood with a clarity that cut through his exhaustion that his vigil had been witnessed by more than just rain and stone, that his private ritual had somehow become public narrative. The President of the United States walked across Arlington National Cemetery with the measured pace of someone who understood that grief had its own geography, its own topography that could not be rushed or compressed into the efficient timelines that governed the rest of the executive schedule. Thomas watched the approach with a sensation like vertigo, his exhausted mind struggling to reconcile the presence of the nation's highest office with the intimate private space of his vigil, struggling to understand how a promise made in jungle mud had somehow reached the Oval Office and compelled a response. The Secret Service agents fanned out slightly, maintaining their protective formation while trying to preserve some semblance of dignity and respect for the sacred ground they crossed. And Thomas noticed how they moved around the graves rather than over them, how even in their vigilance they honored the dead beneath the grass. The rain had stopped completely now, as though the weather itself recognized the significance of the moment and had decided to grant a temporary ceasefulness, a pause in the perpetual falling that had marked the night. The sky remained grey, but had lightened to the color of old pearl, luminous without brightness, and a single bird began to sing somewhere in the trees that bordered the cemetery, a sound so unexpected in this place of silence that Thomas almost did not recognize it. The journalist walked slightly behind the main group, and Thomas could see now that the man's earlier kindness had been calculation, that his offer of an umbrella had been the opening gambit in a larger strategy to transform private grief into public story. And Thomas felt a complicated mixture of anger and gratitude that tangled in his chest until he could not separate one emotion from the other. The president stopped perhaps 10 feet from Thomas, the same respectful distance the journalist had maintained the night before, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the space, one man who commanded armies and nuclear codes and the apparatus of American power, and one man who commanded nothing but his own shaking body and a promise made to a dead boy. The president was younger than Thomas expected, though everyone seemed young to him now, with the silver hair that came to all presidents, but eyes that still held some spark of genuine feeling rather than the calculated empathy of politicians. He wore a dark suit that was slightly damp around the shoulders and shoes that had accumulated mud from the walk across the grass. And Thomas noticed with some satisfaction that even presidents could not walk through Arlington without carrying some of the earth on their feet. The military aides stood at attention, their postures perfect despite the wet ground, their faces carefully neutral in the way military faces always were when bearing witness to emotion too large for expression. One of them carried a wreath, simple white flowers arranged in the traditional circle, and Thomas recognized it as the official presidential wreath, the one laid at the tomb of the unknown soldier during ceremonies of remembrance. The presence of the wreath made something in Thomas's chest tighten further, because it suggested this was not just a photo opportunity or political gesture, but something approaching genuine honor, genuine recognition of what Miller had given and what Thomas had spent 47 years refusing to forget. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the smell of wet grass and stone, and the particular earthy scent of a cemetery after rain. And Thomas thought about how Miller would have hated all this attention, would have been mortified by the idea of the president coming to visit his grave. The president moved closer, crossing from 10 feet to 5 feet, entering the intimate space that humans instinctively reserved for friends and family, and Thomas tensed again because proximity felt dangerous, felt like it might crack the careful armor he had built from exhaustion and determination and 47 years of standing guard. The president's eyes moved from Thomas's face to Miller's grave, reading the simple marker with its spare information. And Thomas wondered what the man saw there, what meaning he extracted from dates and rank and the single word Vietnam carved beneath everything else. The president was young enough that Vietnam was history rather than memory for him, was something learned from books and films rather than lived in body and bone. And Thomas felt the familiar bitterness rise in his throat at the thought of war becoming abstract, becoming policy rather than the specific horror of watching a 19-year-old boy bleed out in his arms. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the sound of that single bird still singing and the distant traffic on Memorial Drive continuing its indifferent movement. And Thomas realized that the president was waiting for him to speak first, was granting him the authority that came from proximity to death and grief. But Thomas found his voice had deserted him, found that 8 hours of rain and vigil had stripped away his ability to form words, had reduced him to just body and promise, and the terrible knowledge that this moment, whatever it was, meant the vigil was ending. The Secret Service agents maintained their positions, but had relaxed slightly, recognizing that whatever threat an exhausted 70-year-old veteran posed had been neutralized by his own weariness, and one of them pulled out a phone and spoke quietly into it, probably reporting that the situation was secure, that the president was safe among the dead and the dying. The president finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the practiced modulation of someone accustomed to being recorded. But underneath the professional veneer, Thomas heard something that sounded almost genuine, a thread of actual emotion woven through the political performance. He spoke about the journalist's story, about how it had reached his desk through channels Thomas could not begin to imagine, about how he had read it that morning over coffee, while his staff prepared his schedule, and something in the simple tale of loyalty had compelled him to clear 2 hours from a day that was normally planned down to the minute. He spoke about sacrifice and honor and the debt the nation owed to those who served, the familiar rhetoric of remembrance that Thomas had heard 1,000 times. But then his voice shifted and became more particular, more specific, and he asked Thomas about Miller, asked him to tell Miller's story, not as a dead soldier but as a living boy. And Thomas found his voice returning because that was the one story he could always tell. Thomas began speaking without consciously deciding to speak, the words emerging from somewhere deeper than thought, pulled from the place where memory lived in muscle and bone rather than mind. He told the president about Miller's arrival in Vietnam, how he had stepped off the transport plane with eyes so wide and terrified that Thomas had known immediately the boy would not survive, that the jungle would consume him the way it consumed all softness and hope, and the idea that there was any justice in the world. He spoke about how Miller had been assigned to his unit, how Thomas had tried to be the hard sergeant who would knock the innocence out of the kid before the enemy did it more permanently. But Miller had resisted every attempt at corruption, had maintained a stubborn sweetness that made him beloved by everyone and protected by no one. The president listened without interrupting, his face showing concentration that seemed genuine rather than performed, and the military aides shifted slightly, their professional neutrality cracking around the edges as the story made them remember their own fallen brothers, their own Millers who had not come home. Thomas's voice grew stronger as he spoke, the act of narration pulling him back from the edge of collapse, giving him purpose beyond just standing and breathing and maintaining presence. He described Miller's laugh, which had been ridiculous and infectious, how it would ring out across the firebase during the brief moments of calm between terror, how even officers could not discipline it away because it reminded everyone that somewhere beneath the uniforms and weapons and fear, they were all still human and still capable of joy. He told about the photograph of Miller's mother that lived in his helmet, how Miller would kiss it with such unself-conscious devotion that other soldiers teased him mercilessly, but also envied that simple faith in love's ability to protect. Thomas had seen the photograph once, a faded color snapshot of a middle-aged woman standing in a garden somewhere in Tennessee, her face round and kind, and completely unaware that her son was carrying her image into a war that would consume him. Miller had told Thomas about his mother's garden, about how she grew tomatoes that were legendary in their small town, about how she sang while she worked the soil and believed that plants grew better when they heard music. The memory of that conversation, held in a foxhole during a mortar attack, while Miller trembled and tried not to cry, hit Thomas with fresh force, and his voice wavered, broke, then steadied again. The president's expression had shifted into something Thomas recognized because he had seen it in mirrors for 47 years. The look of someone confronting the specific weight of individual loss rather than the abstract tragedy of casualty numbers. Thomas continued speaking, telling about the ambush that had taken Miller, though ambush was too clean a word for what had happened when their patrol had triggered a mine that someone's hands had buried with the specific intention of tearing American bodies apart. He described the sound, which was not like the explosions in movies, but was instead a flat crack followed by immediate screaming, described how he had been thrown backward by the blast and had known before he even hit the ground that Miller was gone, because that kind of knowing lived in the body before the mind could process it. But Miller had not been gone immediately, had lingered in that terrible space between living and dying for almost 20 minutes, while the medic worked frantically and uselessly and other soldiers formed a perimeter and fired at shadows in the jungle. Thomas had held Miller's hand, had felt the life leaving through the boy's fingers like water through a sieve, and Miller had looked at him with eyes that were terrified and sorry, and already beginning to see something Thomas could not. Something beyond the jungle and the pain and the failing body. Miller had tried to speak, had worked his lips around words that came out wet and broken, and Thomas had leaned close to hear, had put his ear right against Miller's mouth to catch the final message. Miller had not spoken to his mother or God or home, had instead gripped Thomas's hand with surprising strength and made him promise to not leave him alone, to make sure he was remembered, to stand guard against the particular oblivion that waited for young men who died far from anyone who loved them. Thomas's voice finally broke completely on that last detail. The promise that had shaped 47 years, spilling out into the grey morning air of Arlington National Cemetery, and he could not continue speaking because the grief that lived in his throat had finally become too large for words. The president stood, absolutely still, his own eyes bright with emotion that might have been tears, or might have been the particular brightness that came from witnessing something too real for political performance. The military aides no longer maintained their professional neutrality. their faces showing naked emotion, and one of them, a young woman with ribbons on her chest that suggested combat service, wiped openly at her eyes with no attempt at concealment. The journalist stood at a distance, not recording or taking notes, but simply bearing witness with an expression that suggested he understood. He had stumbled into something larger than story, something that resisted reduction to narrative. The silence that followed Thomas's words was absolute, as though the cemetery itself was holding its breath, as though the thousands of dead beneath the grass were listening with the rapt attention of an audience that understood the weight of promises made and kept. The president finally moved, not speaking but stepping forward to close the remaining distance between them, and placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder with a touch that was gentle and firm, and carried the weight of the office he held. Thomas could feel the pressure of that hand through his soaked jacket, could feel how it was trying to communicate something that words could not hold, gratitude and sorrow and the particular shame of the living who send the young to die and then struggle to remember them. The bird that had been singing fell silent, and in the absence of its voice, Thomas could hear his own breathing, ragged and wet, and realized he was crying for the first time in years. The president stepped back from Thomas, but did not break eye contact, did not allow the momentary connection to dissolve into political theater or performative gesture. And then he did something that shocked Thomas into a stillness deeper than exhaustion. The President of the United States came to full attention, his posture shifting into the precise military bearing that suggested he had served or had been trained meticulously for this specific moment, and raised his hand in a salute that was directed not at Thomas but at Miller's grave, at the white marker that stood silent witness to 47 years of vigil. The salute was held for a long moment, seconds stretching into something approaching eternity, and Thomas watched as the most powerful person in the nation honored a boy who had died as a private, who had achieved nothing that history would record, who had been forgotten by everyone except one exhausted old man. The military aides immediately followed their commander's lead, their own hands rising in synchronized salute, their bodies rigid with the particular discipline that military service instilled into muscle memory until it became more reflex than choice. The Secret Service agents did not salute because they were civilians, but they too came to attention. Their usual watchful scanning paused in deference to something they recognized as sacred, even if it fell outside their operational protocols. The journalist stood with his head bowed, his earlier satisfaction at securing the story replaced by something approaching humility, as though he finally understood that what he had witnessed and reported was not his to claim or package, but belonged to some larger category of human experience that resisted commodification. The wind picked up again, stronger now, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled a warning of more rain to come. Thomas found himself straightening, despite the pain screaming through his back and legs, found his own arm rising in an answering salute that his body remembered even when his mind felt too fractured to command movement. His hand trembled as it rose, the shake visible and undeniable. But he held the position because this was the first time in 47 years that someone else had acknowledged Miller's service with the formal respect of a salute. The first time the vigil had been witnessed and validated by someone with the authority to speak for the nation that had sent Miller to die. Tears continued to stream down Thomas's face, mixing with the rain residue that still clung to his skin, and he did not try to stop them or hide them because grief was not shameful here among the dead, where everyone understood the cost of survival. The president finally lowered his hand, the salute ending with the crisp precision of military protocol, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality. No longer the measured tones of political speech, but something rawer, more immediate, stripped of the careful distance that leaders maintained between themselves and the consequences of their orders. He said that Thomas's loyalty honored not just Miller, but honored them all, honored everyone who had served and died and been remembered or forgotten, said that the nation could not repay what soldiers gave, but could at least bear witness when someone else refused to let memory die. The words were simple, almost inadequate, but Thomas heard beneath them the genuine recognition that his vigil had meant something, that 47 years of standing guard had been seen and understood and would not be dismissed as the delusion of a traumatized old man. The president turned to one of the military aides and gestured, and the aide stepped forward with the presidential wreath, holding it out with both hands in a posture of offering. The president took the wreath carefully, respectfully, and then knelt on the wet grass beside Miller's grave, with no concern for his suit or the mud that immediately stained his knees, or the cameras that would surely capture this moment and broadcast it into history. He placed the wreath against the marker with both hands, adjusting it until it sat perfectly centered. And then he spoke to Miller directly, addressing the dead boy as though he could hear, telling him that his sacrifice was not forgotten, that his friend had kept the promise, that he could rest, knowing that his service had been honored by his nation. The words were perhaps theater, perhaps performance for the cameras and the eventual news coverage, but Thomas heard in them something that sounded like actual prayer, like genuine communication with the dead, rather than political gesture. The president stood, his knees dark with mud and grass stains, and turned back to Thomas with an expression that mixed sadness and something approaching plea. He said what Thomas already knew was coming, what he had known from the moment the cars appeared and the approach began, that it was time for Thomas to leave, that the vigil could end now, that Miller would not be alone because the nation was watching and would remember. The words landed in Thomas's chest like weights, like stones piled on top of the other stones he had been carrying for 47 years. And he felt his legs beginning to give way beneath him, the accumulated exhaustion finally winning its war against determination. The president reached out and caught him, actually touched him, and supported his weight. And Thomas felt the bizarreness of being held upright by the President of the United States in the middle of Arlington National Cemetery while he fought against collapse. One of the Secret Service agents moved forward immediately, speaking quietly into his radio and probably summoning medical support because an exhausted 70-year-old veteran collapsing in front of the president represented exactly the kind of situation their training prepared them to handle. But Thomas waved them off with a hand that still trembled, found his footing again, locked his knees and straightened his spine through sheer force of will that had sustained him through worse than this, through nights in the jungle and years of grief and the slow erosion of everything except the promise. He looked at the president and then past him to Miller's grave, to the white marker now adorned with the presidential wreath, and felt something in his chest begin to loosen. Some knot that had been pulled tight for 47 years, finally beginning to release its hold on his breathing. The president spoke again, his voice gentle but firm, telling Thomas that Miller would be proud of him, that the vigil had been enough, that some promises could be fulfilled and then released without breaking faith with the dead. Thomas took his first step away from Miller's grave and felt as though he was tearing his own flesh, as though invisible roots had grown from his feet into the earth over 47 years and were now being ripped free with each movement. His legs barely supported his weight, muscles screaming with the agony of resumed motion after hours of stillness. And he would have fallen if the president had not maintained a hand on his elbow, steadying him with a touch that was both supportive and ceremonial. The military aides moved closer, forming a loose escort without making it obvious they were preparing to catch him if he fell, their faces showing concern mixed with the particular respect that soldiers reserved for those who had carried impossible burdens longer than seemed humanly possible. Thomas looked back over his shoulder at Miller's grave, at the white marker with its fresh wreath, and felt panic rising in his throat like bile. The journalist approached from where he had been standing at a respectful distance, his expression cautious, perhaps aware that Thomas might blame him for transforming private grief into public spectacle, for bringing cameras and presidents to a place that had been sacred precisely because of its anonymity. But what Thomas saw in the man's face was not exploitation, but rather the peculiar satisfaction of someone who understood they had done something right, had recognized a story that deserved telling, and had told it in a way that compelled action rather than just sympathy. The journalist spoke quietly, saying he was sorry if he had intruded, sorry if the attention was unwelcome, but that he had believed Thomas's vigil deserved to be seen, deserved to become part of the larger narrative of how the nation remembered its dead. Thomas wanted to be angry, but could not find the energy for rage, could only nod in acknowledgement that what was done was done. The walk from Section 60 to the vehicles felt impossibly long, though it could not have been more than 200 yards across grass that squelched underfoot with the accumulated rain of the night. Each step required conscious effort, Thomas's body moving through space with the uncertain gait of someone relearning how to walk after extended paralysis, and he could feel his feet sliding slightly in his waterlogged boots, blisters that had formed during the night, making themselves known with each pressure point. The cemetery stretched around them in all directions, thousands upon thousands of white markers receding into the grey morning, and Thomas thought about all the other Millers buried here, all the other promises made and kept or broken, all the other veterans standing guard in ways invisible to presidents and cameras and the nation that had sent them to war. The Secret Service agents maintained their protective formation, but had relaxed their posture slightly, recognizing that the primary danger was not assassination, but rather the collapse of an exhausted old man who had pushed his body beyond its limits for the sake of memory. One of them spoke quietly into his radio, requesting medical evaluation when they reached the vehicles. And Thomas heard it with a mixture of irritation and relief, because he knew his body needed attention, but hated the weakness that requiring help represented. The president walked beside him in silence, not attempting conversation or further comfort, seeming to understand that words had been exhausted, and what remained was only the slow, physical reality of one foot in front of the other, of distance, gradually accumulating between present and past. They passed other graves as they walked, and Thomas found himself reading the markers instinctively, absorbing names and dates and wars. Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, conflicts stretching back through decades of American military engagement around the world. Each marker represented a Miller, represented someone who had been 19 or 23 or 37 when they died, someone who had left behind mothers and friends and lovers who might or might not still remember their faces. Thomas wondered how many of these graves were visited regularly, how many had their own vigilant sentinels standing watch against forgetting, and how many had already slipped into the anonymity that waited for all the dead, once the living who loved them had themselves died. The thought made his chest tight with grief that extended beyond Miller to encompass all the forgotten dead, all the memories that dissolved when the last person who carried them closed their eyes for the final time. The vehicles came into view, black and official and completely out of place in the cemetery's landscape of grass and stone and grief. A small crowd had gathered at a distance, tourists or cemetery visitors who had noticed the motorcade and Secret Service presence and had pulled out their phones to record whatever was happening, transforming Thomas's private agony into content for social media, into stories they would tell at dinner parties about the time they saw the president at Arlington. Thomas felt exposed suddenly, vulnerable in a way he had not felt during the night when only rain and darkness witnessed his vigil, and he hunched his shoulders against the weight of all those watching eyes. The president seemed to sense his discomfort and shifted his position slightly, using his body to partially block Thomas from the cameras and phones, a gesture of protection that Thomas had not expected and did not know how to process. A paramedic was waiting by one of the vehicles, a young woman with kind eyes and efficient movements, who immediately began assessing Thomas with the practiced skill of someone accustomed to treating people who were too stubborn to admit they needed help. She asked him questions. When had he last eaten? Did he have any chest pain? Was he experiencing dizziness or confusion? And Thomas answered automatically while his mind remained elsewhere, still standing at Miller's grave, still maintaining the vigil that his body had abandoned, but his consciousness refused to release. The paramedic wrapped a blanket around his shoulders despite his protests, explaining that his core temperature had dropped dangerously low and that hypothermia was not something to dismiss lightly at his age. Thomas accepted the blanket because refusing would only prolong the attention, but he felt ridiculous wrapped in the emergency foil, like a marathon runner who had collapsed at the finish line. The president stood nearby, not leaving even though his schedule must have been backing up with each minute spent here in the cemetery, even though his staff was probably frantically recalculating times and cancelling meetings and explaining to disappointed constituents why the president was delayed. He spoke quietly with one of his aides, and Thomas caught fragments of conversation. Something about making sure Thomas had transportation home, about arranging follow-up care through the VA, about ensuring the story was told correctly and completely so that Miller's memory and Thomas's vigil would not be reduced to sound bites and political capital. The aide nodded seriously and made notes on a tablet, and Thomas realized with something approaching wonder that the most powerful office in the nation was being deployed on behalf of a dead private and an exhausted sergeant, that bureaucracy was being bent toward remembrance rather than policy. The president approached Thomas one final time before departing, his suit still bearing the mud stains from kneeling at Miller's grave, his expression carrying the weight of someone who understood they had witnessed something that would remain with them longer than most of the decisions made in the Oval Office. He extended his hand, and Thomas took it, their grip firm despite Thomas's exhaustion, and for a moment they simply stood there in that most basic of human connections, palm pressed to palm, lives intersecting across gulfs of power and circumstance, and the particular geography that separated those who ordered wars from those who fought them. The president spoke quietly. His words meant only for Thomas, saying that he would ensure Miller's grave received the recognition it deserved, that the story of Thomas's vigil would be preserved in the national memory, that sometimes individual loyalty mattered more than grand strategy or political calculation. Thomas felt something crack inside him at those words, some final defense giving way, and he found himself speaking before he consciously decided to, found himself telling the president what he had never admitted to anyone, including himself, during 47 years of standing guard. He said he did not know if he had kept the vigil for Miller or for himself, did not know if the promise had been about honoring the dead or about punishing himself for surviving. Did not know if standing at the grave had been devotion or penance, or some terrible combination that had consumed his life and given it meaning simultaneously. The confession emerged in fragments, the words tangled and raw, and Thomas expected judgment or pity, or the careful therapeutic language that people used when confronted with trauma they could not comprehend. But the president only nodded slowly, his expression showing understanding rather than shock, and said that maybe it did not matter why Thomas had kept the promise, only that he had kept it. That intention was less important than action when it came to memory and honor and the work of bearing witness to those who could no longer speak for themselves. He said that guilt and love were often impossible to separate in the aftermath of war, that survival carried its own wounds that were no less real for being invisible, and that Thomas should allow himself the possibility that he had done something worthy and necessary, even if it had cost him everything. The words landed in Thomas's chest like absolution he had not sought and did not feel he deserved. But they settled there nonetheless, taking up residence beside the grief and guilt and exhaustion. The paramedic insisted that Thomas needed to go to the hospital for proper evaluation and warming, that standing in rain for 8 hours at 70 years old was not something to dismiss with blankets and hot coffee. But Thomas refused with the same stubborn determination that had kept him standing through the night. He would go home, would take care of himself, would call his daughter, who he had not spoken to in 3 months, because she did not understand his need to visit Miller's grave, and he did not know how to explain it. The paramedic looked to the president as though seeking authority to override Thomas's wishes, but the president shook his head slightly, recognizing that Thomas had earned the right to make his own decisions even if they were not optimal, that some autonomy could not and should not be overruled by medical expertise or presidential concern. The military aides saluted Thomas before departing, a formal gesture that shocked him because they were saluting up the chain of rank, officers honoring an enlisted man, and the reversal of protocol carried its own weight of respect and recognition. Thomas returned the salute with a hand that still trembled, but had regained some steadiness, and he felt the ancient muscle memory of military service flowing through the gesture, connecting him backward through time to the sergeant he had been in Vietnam, forward through time to the veteran he had become. The journalist approached one more time, asking if Thomas would be willing to do a longer interview about Miller, about the war, about what the vigil had meant. And Thomas surprised himself by agreeing, because maybe Miller's story deserved more than just a grave marker and one old man's memory. Maybe it deserved to be told and retold until it became part of the larger narrative of what war cost. The president's motorcade departed with the quiet efficiency of practice security protocols, the black vehicles sliding away through the cemetery gates and returning to the world of policy and politics, and the vast machinery of governance that never stopped, even for individual grief. Thomas watched them go from beside the paramedic's vehicle, wrapped in his emergency blanket, feeling simultaneously abandoned and relieved. The pressure of presidential attention lifting like a weight he had not known he was carrying. The small crowd of onlookers dispersed, returning to their own business now that the spectacle had ended, and the cemetery returned to its usual stillness, the dead resuming their patient wait for visitors who would come or not come, would remember or forget. Thomas turned to look back toward Section 60, toward where Miller's grave stood with its presidential wreath marking it as special, as worthy of national attention, and he felt the pull to return, to resume the vigil, to maintain the promise that had structured his life for 47 years. But his legs would not carry him back, his body staging a mutiny against his will, insisting on survival even when consciousness wanted to return to the familiar comfort of standing guard. The paramedic guided him gently toward her vehicle, saying she would at least drive him home if he refused the hospital. And Thomas allowed himself to be guided, because resistance required energy he no longer possessed. He climbed into the vehicle with movements that felt ancient, every joint protesting, and sat heavily on the seat that seemed impossibly comfortable after 8 hours of standing. As they drove toward the cemetery gates, Thomas looked out the window at the endless rows of white markers, at the landscape of sacrifice that stretched as far as eyes could see, and he thought about promises and loyalty and the particular burden of surviving when better people had died. He thought about Miller's face in those final moments, about the terror and trust combined in the boy's eyes, about how Miller had believed Thomas's promise would mean something, would provide comfort in the face of oblivion. For 47 years, Thomas had believed that keeping the promise required his physical presence, required standing guard in all weather and all seasons, but now he wondered if the president's visit had changed something fundamental, had transformed a private vigil into public memory that could survive without his body as its anchor. The thought brought both relief and loss. The sensation of a life's purpose simultaneously fulfilled and emptied of future meaning. The cemetery gates passed behind them, and the vehicle entered the normal flow of Arlington traffic, surrounded by people driving to work or running errands or conducting the thousand mundane activities that constituted civilian life. Thomas watched the ordinary world with the strange detachment of someone returning from a long journey, seeing familiar landscapes made foreign by extended absence. The paramedic asked him for his address, and he provided it automatically, directing her toward the small apartment he had lived in alone since his second divorce, the space that was barely more than a place to sleep between vigils. He wondered what he would do with his time now, how he would fill the hours that had been structured by standing at Miller's grave. And the question brought a panic that tightened his throat until breathing required conscious effort. The paramedic noticed his distress and asked if he was okay, and Thomas lied and said yes because the truth was too complicated for the kindness of strangers. They arrived at his building, a modest complex of units that housed other veterans and retirees, people who lived quietly on fixed incomes and carried their own invisible wounds. The paramedic insisted on walking him to his door, on making sure he was safely inside before she left, and Thomas was too tired to protest the escort. His apartment was exactly as he had left it the previous evening. Dishes in the sink, unmade bed, walls bare except for a single framed photograph of his unit in Vietnam, Miller's face visible in the back row, forever 19 and smiling that ridiculous smile. Thomas stood in his doorway looking at the photograph for a long moment, and the paramedic followed his gaze and understood without being told. She said something about service and sacrifice and honor, the familiar phrases people offered when confronted with veteran grief, and then she left, closing the door quietly behind her. Alone in his apartment, Thomas moved to the small window that looked out over the parking lot and the street beyond, watching ordinary life continue its ordinary movement, and he felt the enormousness of what had happened beginning to settle into his bones. The President of the United States had come to Miller's grave, had saluted a dead private, had granted Thomas permission to release a promise that had become his entire existence. He knew he should feel relief, should feel grateful, should feel that his vigil had been validated and honored. But what he actually felt was untethered, adrift, as though the anchor that had kept him fixed in space and time had been suddenly cut, and he was now floating toward an unknown shore. He thought about calling his daughter, about trying to explain what had happened, but the words would not form, because how did you tell someone that the president's compassion felt like theft, like having the most important thing in your life taken away even as it was being honored? Thomas moved to his bed and lay down without removing his wet clothes or boots, the exhaustion finally claiming him completely, dragging him down into unconsciousness with the irresistible force of gravity. As sleep took him, his final conscious thought was of Miller's face in those last moments, and whether the boy would understand that Thomas had not broken the promise, but had instead had it transformed by witness, made into something larger and more permanent than one old man standing in rain. The thought brought neither comfort nor resolution, only the deep ache of grief that would outlive consciousness and follow him even into dreams, where Miller was always 19 and always dying and always asking Thomas to promise what could not truly be promised. That death would not mean being forgotten, that memory could defeat oblivion, that love was stronger than the particular annihilation that waited for all soldiers who fell far from home.